So the next panel now, after the refreshment, is on historical human rights in international perspectives. It's a little bit bigger because on the next panel, which would have been on 3:30 on European perspectives, we had a little bit of problems because two panelists had to cancel, and so we did cut it off so that we have a little bit more time for intensive discussions. And now we have 6 people and experts on human rights and the international perspective on the panel. And Gin Mayang, whom you already know from the other panel, civil rights lawyer and writer from New York, will introduce the panelist and is the chair of this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back again. You won't hear much from me other than to introduce our fine panelists and perhaps cut them off if they go on for a little too long. So our first panelist, without further ado, is Michael Charney, who is the professor of Southeast Asia and Military Studies at SOAS in London.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to talk. I'm one of the irrelevant historians. The Rohingya genocide is as confusing as it is complex. There's a fog that obscures what is happening on the ground in historical perspective because so much is happening so quickly in real time. The Myanmar state, both the civil government and the Damodar, have actively taken advantage of this situation to accomplish 2 things. And as we speak here in the Berlin Jewish Museum, it's relevant to point out that the Nazis fought both the war on the Jews and used the war on the Jews to fight a war on German liberalism. As with the Holocaust, the Myanmar state is currently fighting a war against the Rohingya on the one hand, but also a war on emerging Myanmar liberalism on the other. What is happening right now is about the Rohingya, but not only about the Rohingya. The state and the Damodar have very adeptly blinded the Bamar population and many of the ethnic minorities to the eradication of liberalism within the country with the willing support of Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party. There are many other scholars here better versed than I in genocide studies. What I intend to talk about instead is how successive states in Myanmar have actively used scholars in history, both in the past and today, to obscure the truth and support state programs that have worked against the Rohingya. Now, as a bit of background, in the 15th century, the kingdoms of Ava and Bago tried to establish cultural hegemony over the Indo-Aryan kingdom of Rakhine, importing kings and queens, courtiers, Buddhist monks, and Burmese-speaking settlers. The Rakhine ruler, who ousted these foreign invaders, established a religiously hybrid court, a sultanate, but in addition to permitting Buddhist immigration and European migrants from abroad, also raided Bengal and brought to Rakhine thousands of Bengali Muslims every year. Many of these were planted in the Galadan River areas, close to the concentrations of Muslims in Rakhine today, where they grew rice and still grow rice, at least they did until the recent crisis. We do not find a lot of pre-18th century tensions between the Buddhist and Muslim populations. The physical geography and climate favored approaches to living and ruling, interacting, and community building, social mentalities that were flexible and inclusive, that favored the emergence of ethnically and religiously diverse communities. But this diversity was soon obscured by another invasion from the Irrawaddy Valley. When the Myanmar court conquered Rakhine in 1784, it tried to produce histories that made Rakhine historically a part of Greater Myanmar. Myanmar Buddhism was introduced, court literature and local Buddha images were brought back to the Irrawaddy Valley, and so too were tens of thousands of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. Rakhine Buddhists and Muslims both fled to British Bengal, the Buddhists settling in the area that became a big refugee camp at the end of the 18th century, which became known as Cox's Bazar after Hiram Cox. The Cox's Bazar that has become the refugee camp for the Muslims today, for the Rohingya today. Absent court literature, Buddhist monks from Rakhine rewrote from memory and produced new chronicles in opposition to Myanmar rule, but in doing so, created a Rakhine history only from their particular point of view, not purposely leaving the Rohingya voice out at the time, but not including it either. This might have been balanced out with Rohingya voices if it had not been for another accident of history, the replacement of Myanmar rule with British rule in 1824. The British believed that communities had one native language, one native race, and one native religion. Despite, or rather because of its huge diversity, the British decided that they would split Rakhine in two, the northern half, which had a heavier concentration of Muslim and Bengali speakers, would be administered by Bengal and eventually became part of Bangladesh after independence, and the southern part, closer to the An Pass and the heavier concentration of Buddhist and Burmese speakers, would be joined or rejoined to Myanmar. Arthur Fair produced the first histories of Rakhine and Myanmar during the 1830s and 1840s and used sources for the region's history exclusively from Rakhine Buddhist informants and their summaries of Rakhine Buddhist histories. Fair was thus blinded to the fact that Rakhine had, at least since the 15th century, been a Buddhist and a Muslim land with a Muslim and a Buddhist court, and that historically Burmese-speaking Theravada Buddhists from the Irrawaddy Valley were migrating into Rakhine at the same time as Muslim Bengali speakers. In his writings, Rakhine became essentially a Theravada Buddhist Burmese-speaking land. Later in 1862, when Rakhine became part of British Burma, it declined into an impoverished, neglected periphery of an Irrawaddy-based state, its population impoverished where it had once been wealthy, and Muslims and Buddhists together began to compete for pieces of an ever-shrinking economic pie. During this period, Rakhine and Rohingya, with it, became absorbed into a new myth created by Bamar nationalists in response to colonial rule, but also informed by Fair's ethno-racial histories, the myth of 1824. In general, the myth held that the British had altered the system against Bamar Buddhists, who were the indigenous population in this view, located since time immemorial within the boundaries of the Myanmar Kingdom and the modern Myanmar nation state. The myth of 1824 claimed that the British introduced colonial rule into Rakhine and removed the obstacles to foreigners coming into the country and invited in thousands of Bengali Muslims who the British believed were better workers than the indigenous Buddhists. This was claimed to have created the first major Muslim populations in the region, led to Muslims overrunning northern Rakhine, forcing the indigenous Buddhists out. By extension, as each part of Myanmar was acquired by the British over the course of the 19th century, Indian immigration was said to have continued without legal controls. And it was also claimed that foreigner Indians, including the Muslim Bengalis and the foreigner Chinese, remained loyal to their homelands, retained their foreign cultures and religions, and sent their money when they could back home. The myth of 1824 did not get voiced a great deal in the 1950s, however. Under the semi-liberal rule of UNU and the AFPFL, the emphasis was on national identity through ethnic union, not Bamar ethnic chauvinism or racialism. Because the Rohingya had stood up against separatist Muslims from Bengal, they were praised as a national race in 1954 by a grateful UNU for having helped to save the union. But this feeling shifted in 1962 with the takeover by a poorly educated military group led by General Ne Win. The military introduced into state policy the idea of Ta Yin Tha, the 135 national races. The numbers seem to change every time somebody speaks about it. The Myanmar military ethos at the time was and remains geared around the idea that Myanmar is not just of Bamars, but of the Bamars an assortment of ethnic minorities who pay tribute to the Myanmar ruler. When that hierarchy is not maintained politically, it was the military that restored it, maintained it, and ensured it. And without this hierarchy, there is no order, and the Bamars would be faced with annihilation. This concept picked up speed in the post-independence period, in particular from its prominence in Revolutionary Council thinking from 1964, and was pushed into school texts and other government publications in the last couple of decades. The Ta Yin Tha idea became the foundation for the 1982 citizenship laws. Key to the Ta Yin Tha idea was that any group that was not indigenous and was foreign was a threat to national solidarity. In combination, the myth of 1824 and the citizenship laws of 1982 have had a disproportionate impact on the Rohingya. The myth of 1824 portrayed the Rohingyas as non-indigenous and as Indians, as Gala, and the 1982 citizenship laws established three categories of citizenship. If you were a member of one of the national races, you were a citizen, even if you did not have papers. If you were not, you had to have papers showing that you had been in Myanmar in 1948. This made only the Rohingya and other officially non-nationals peculiarly vulnerable to registration abuse. In 1978, in the run-up to the enactment of the 1982 Citizenship law, military operations, the Naga Min operations, were run at the border to sweep out undocumented aliens. This caused the first major exodus of the Rohingya out of the country, 250,000, and many who had documentation saw these replaced by a new card. And when the military replaced the BSPP government in 1988, it required a change of documentation yet again, in which the government officers denied registration to many Rohingya. In any case, the junta at the time reified a line of thinking about Rakhine that could be traced back in one way or another to Arthur Sverre's work in the 1830s. Buddhist Rakhine were Rakhine, but Muslim Rakhine, the Rohingya, were not. The idea that the Rohingya are not part of the 135 races like others is very significant because it wrongly makes the Rohingya appear to be a negative legacy of British colonialism, and thus something that can and must be dealt with as part of the last steps of achieving true independence. It is the reason Myanmar authorities would not permit Rohingya children to attend schools of any kind, except for madrasas, so they could learn the Quran and nothing else. It is why the Bangladeshi government has had to provide basic training in different skills to earlier waves of Rohingya refugees, because so many are functionally illiterate and lack skills of any kind to use to support themselves economically. But it is the act of trying to correct these poorly founded claims, claiming Rohingya to be a national race, that makes Buddhist Rakhine and others upset. The underlying tension, then, that has caused the explosion is a very old one, 200 years in the making, because of colonial-era Orientalist misunderstandings of the region's history. British colonial administration and scholarship encouraged Rakhine Buddhist hostility to Muslims during the colonial period. If we remove the colonial myth, it is clear that the Rohingya are just as much a Italian thought as anyone else. How we understand Rakhine, the Rohingya, and Myanmar ethnicities today is a result of numerous phases of successive states and non-state actors responding to policies of those states shaping the historical record for a political purpose. The Rohingya have been negatively and peculiarly impacted by these efforts because of historical accidents that placed them on the wrong side of the border. The Rohingya did not cross the border crossed them. With military rule, the Myanmar state has increasingly tried to integrate Burmese Buddhists in Rakhine with the national Bamar ethnic group. In fact, one way to view the problems we see now in northern Rakhine is that these anti-Rohingya pogroms are the last thrusts of full lowland state integration, the Myanmar military literally pushing Bamar civilization up the hills. The Myanmar state is now fully integrating its frontier, non-state spaces into the body politic, and with it the national language, the national faith, and the national culture, so that as somebody mentioned, in 10 years there won't be a Karen. Pushing out in this way the Rohingya, who they see as not belonging. But what happened in the historiography of the Rohingya was also reinforced by the impact of area studies on scholars who studied Myanmar. With independence from 1948, Myanmar was a country, not a colony, and everyone domestically and abroad who studied Rakhine and the religious problems or any other aspect of Rakhine history were trained to view Rakhine as an eternally Theravada Buddhist land, as a part of Myanmar. This is why you will find a number of scholars who adamantly deny the existence of the Rohingya in the historical past. They have been trained to only read the country by Bamar Buddhist register. But this ahistorical legacy has caused them to introduce a new era of untruths, writing histories that try to erase the Rohingya and their history as merely being incorrect data, rather than as people with a historical narrative that challenges their own view. This ahistorical legacy has also led colonial era and Rakhine and Bamar archaeologists since to reconstruct religious buildings in ways that obscured a Muslim presence, to rely upon only Rakhine Buddhist chronicles and other texts as the only acceptable historical sources, and to consider references to Rakhine as a Muslim society or as some kind of eclectic mixture of different religious groups as a misunderstanding by European traders that found its way into historiography. Rather than kicking out, in a sense, the Rakhine Buddhists from this region, I'm merely inviting the Rohingya back into their own history, which they shared in an intimate way with the Rakhine Buddhists before the divisions that were introduced by a series of states that were interested in how best to control power rather than reflect in a fair way the peoples who had historically been part of Myanmar. Well, in conclusion, I would like to stress that the only realistic way to decolonize this situation and protect the Rohingya is to secure for them a protected homeland. If we can stop the current genocide, not only will we save the Rohingya, we'll also save Myanmar from itself. A future Myanmar freed from the Tatmadaws' grip will be eternally grateful for having prevented any further continuation of the horrific events that have taken place. Thank you.